And I don't like to say I told you so, but I did say this, I think about a year and a half ago on this show. This is from Politico, announcing that Senator Scott Brown, Republican, Massachusetts, and Ron Wyden, Democrat, Oregon, are introducing legislation today to reform healthcare reform. Okay, so we've now got healthcare reform. When Obamacare passed, remember President Obama said, well, you know, we've been trying to reform healthcare for decades. And we finally accomplished it. And all his courtiers in the press said, wow, that's right, healthcare's done. Now let's go on to cap and trade. That's it, healthcare. Lock it up in the box. Put it in the filing cabinet. We finished it. It's done. Let's go on to what's next. No, the minute you pass healthcare reform, you're passing healthcare reform, and reform unto the end of time. There is no end to it. And I said I'd seen this, in a lot of other countries. In Commonwealth countries, they appoint a royal commission every couple of years, when it gets to like a 3-year wait list for the, for your MRI, or the 10-month waiting list for the maternity ward or whatever. Then they introduce, they set up a royal commission like this debt commission. They put a lot of big shots on it, and the big shots propose ways of reforming the system, so that people won't notice how bad it is for a couple more years. Usually it's usually things like, they'll introduce a helpline. So for example, you say, you go along and, you've got, cancer, and they say, well, we'd like to start the chemotherapy, but you've got 6 months to live, and there's a 2-year wait to get into the chemotherapy thing. But don't worry, because you can call this 1-800 number and find out, on a day-to-day basis how much longer your chemotherapy has been postponed by. So they'll introduce a new helpline. So you have all the healthcare reform. So now we're getting healthcare. Here we are, getting onto this several decades, half a century after most other Western nations, but it's already settling into the familiar pattern. Senator Scott Brown, Republican, Massachusetts, and Senator Ron Wyden, Democrat, Oregon, will introduce legislation Thursday for reform of the healthcare reform law. Reform. Essentially, it's allowing states to opt out of the so-called individual mandate by imposing on them an obligation to set up their own state equivalent of the individual mandate. That's great, isn't it? So that's what I like about federalism, because you're getting a choice now. You can get a choice now between which level of government it is that forces you to do something you don't want to do. A lot of places, centralized societies don't have that. Now, in the Soviet Union, it was just like the Politburo who would tell you what you had to do. But here in America, we've got a choice. We've got options. So you can have your bankrupt federal government tell you what to do, or your bankrupt state government tell you what to do. That's good. Maybe they can take it down to county level, and we could have, individual mandates imposed by counties. Be fascinating to see that. But what is interesting is that all the people who voted for Obamacare and supported Obamacare, these exemptions that they're getting, I think there's over 100 companies and unions. The SEIU, which was sending guys out to beat people up if they objected to Obamacare, has now secured an exemption from Obamacare. So if you object to Obamacare, they'll beat you up. But because they object to Obamacare, they're getting a special Obama exemption from it. And now they're saying that states would also be allowed to get particular exemptions from it. And this is why, by the way, American big people think, and if you talk to the sort of sappier Democrats, the kind of NPR Democrats, the ones with those voices that sound like somebody's fired an elephant dart into their butt, they've got that very sedated feel, the NPR female NPR listener voice. They say, well, I don't see what would be so wrong if we were to be more like Sweden. And they think that America would be a large Sweden. No, it's not. It's not going to be a large Sweden. Obamacare is going to be a disaster on a scale unknown even to the most decrepit healthcare systems in the world. I don't know. I'm feeling Pamela's butt again, aren't I? I'm getting into dangerous territory there. I don't want to upset Pamela again. But it's going to be a disaster. I'm not saying it's the end of the world, but basically it's going to get us closer to the end of the world than any previous apocalyptic pronouncements of mine have gotten us to. So we have here a disaster on a scale way beyond the British National Health Service or the Canadian health system or anything else, because it's a peculiar combination of the worst elements of the Euro-Canadian government healthcare system, and then all the carve-outs and exemptions and peculiar little local corruptions of the American system. So, you know, the Cornhusker kickback and all the rest of it. And so Senator Brown and Senator Wyden are now effectively are going to provide for the first stage of healthcare reform. This is why I say it's important to drive a stake through the heart of it. A basic rule of thumb is that no healthcare reform ever solves the problem it's intended to solve, but it does give you an exciting range of new ones. I like Mitt Romney, don't get me wrong. He's a nice fella, he's a smart fella. He turned around the Olympics. He made more money out of people doing sports that nobody's got interest in than anyone. All that, if you ask him to make money and find an efficient way to devise a two-man luge event, he can do it. But if you ask a Massachusetts bureaucracy to run a two-man luge event, it's a disaster, and that's what's happened in Massachusetts. Mitt told me that Massachusetts needed to reform its healthcare system because the uninsured were placing huge strains on the state's emergency rooms, and so the rest of the population had to pick up the tab for that, and that was why Massachusetts health costs have been driven up. So now practically everybody in Massachusetts is insured, but emergency room use is higher than ever, and 70% of the newly insured are all but entirely subsidized by state taxpayers, and as a result, Massachusetts residents now pay 30% more for their health care than the US average, and wait longer to find a new family doctor than anybody in the nation, because nobody wants to be a family doctor in Massachusetts, so poor people in Massachusetts trying to find a family doctor, they now got to go up to southern New Hampshire. So when New Hampshire introduces Obamacare, they're going to be having to drive to Canada. And Quebec has the lowest doctor-patient ratio in the world. So they're going to be having to take a boat to Costa Rica or to Cuba or wherever. It never cures. Massachusetts is the perfect example. It never cures the problem it sets out to cure, but it does give you an exciting range of new ones. And what I don't begrudge Senator Brown doing this. Good heavens, you know, he's a Republican from Massachusetts. He's a Republican from Massachusetts. So he has very limited room for maneuver, and he's going to be coming up for re-election, and he's got to start giving a bit of thought to that. But the basic problem is this, that tinkering, by saying that we can run, by the right saying, oh, don't worry about Obamacare, we on the right will be able to reform it and tinker with it, and we will run the big government health bureaucracy more efficiently than the left will run it. Sorry, that's not good enough. That gets you to Jacques Chirac-style conservatism, but it doesn't get you to real conservatism. It doesn't get you to real effective small government. Which is what is needed. This is what to go back to talking to Pamela. This is the kind of stuff that is just going to ensure that these problems stay around with us longer and longer and longer. Already, these 100 companies and unions have figured it out. McDonald's got an exemption because McDonald's has got knows who to call in Washington. When the head guy of McDonald's decides he's got a problem, he can get his senator on the phone. The SEIU, the big union backers, the crack stormtroopers of the Obama era, they knew who to call in Washington. They wanted Obamacare for you, but they don't want to be bound by it themselves, so they got an exemption. The trouble is, if you happen to own Bud's hardware store on Main Street, you can't get an exemption. You don't know who to call in Washington, so you're screwed. Unless you're a big time union, unless you're one of his pals at Goldman Sachs, unless you know how to call in Washington, you can't get an exemption. And that is why reforming Obamacare is not going to do it.